Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson, talking today about a poet, novelist, short story writer, essayist, playwright, literary critic, travel writer, painter, and British expatriate whose savage enough pilgrimage took him from the mining district of Nottinghamshire, England, to Germany, Italy, Ceylon, Australia, a ranch in New Mexico where his cremated remains allegedly had been placed, Mexico City, Bavaria, and the French Riviera. Along the way, becoming one of the most controversial literary figures of the early 20th century. I mean, of course, David Herbert Richards Lawrence, more commonly called D.H. Lawrence. Before passing away from consumption, tuberculosis in contemporary terms, at the age of 45 in 1930, D.H. Lawrence's work had been the subject of a censorship trial and banned in England due to his use of explicit language and highly erotic descriptions. Heterosexual and homosexual with regard to both men and women, and at least a dozen of his paintings, because of their explicit imagery, had been confiscated by the London police from a public exhibition. Yet, after his death, Lawrence was described by fellow English novelist E.M. Forster as one of the greatest writers of his generation. According to a very interesting biography written by Elaine Feinstein titled Lawrence and the Women, The Intimate Life of D.H. Lawrence, published in 1993, many of the complex aspects of this author's life and work, Feinstein asserts, can be explained in terms of the relationships he developed with a number of different women, beginning with his mother and then several other females, including the short story writer Catherine Mansfield, as well as Lawrence's wife, Frieda von Richthofen-Weekly Lawrence, a cousin of the German World War I aviation ace, Baron Manfred von Richthofen, the bloody Red Baron, whose 80 aerial kills of Allied pilots were ultimately immortalized within a 1966 number 2 on the top 40 list popular song about a dogfight with Charles Schulz's canine character Snoopy. In fact, D.H. Lawrence's first publication, which essentially launched his literary career, was the direct result of some poems he had written being submitted in 1908 without the writer's permission or knowledge to Ford Madox Hueffer, who later began calling himself Ford Madox Ford, by a young woman who'd been the first of Lawrence's significant female relationships, aside from his mother, of course, Jessie Chambers. It was this act of feminine advocacy which led to the publication of a first short story titled Odor of Chrysanthemums. In it, using his experience of growing up within an English mining community, Lawrence relates the tale of a wife and mother whose husband does not come home for dinner one evening, causing her to guess that he had gone to a pub after work, only learning later that he had been suffocated as a result of an after-hours cave-in, realizing while cleaning and dressing his body for burial what a stranger he was to her, and that really there had been nothing between them, that he had been apart all the while, living as she never lived, feeling as she never felt. This publication led to a first novel titled The White Peacock, which was subsequently followed by Sons and Lovers, a collection of poems regarding Lawrence's early relationship with his wife, following 2 near engagements to other women, Jessie Chambers and a very beautiful Louisa Barrows, called Look, We Have Come Through, and then novels, largely influenced by the writing of Thomas Hardy, who'd had his own troubles with censors and critics, titled The Rainbow, Women in Love, Kangaroo, The Plumed Serpent, The Virgin and the Gypsy, and Lady Chatterley's Lover, in addition to travel books such as Twilight in Italy, as well as a final work called Apocalypse, presenting an analysis of the biblical book of Revelations. These are accompanied by numerous essays, short stories, critical articles, and plays, in addition to a number of novellas such as Saint Mar, which, according to the blurb on its back cover, offers the story of a splendid stallion in whose vitality the heroine finds the quality that is lacking in the men she knows, and the man who died, within which a swooned and prematurely buried Jesus awakens, realizes the error of his youthful ways, wandering off from his tomb to search for the meaning of life, and finding it in the arms of a priestess for the Egyptian goddess Isis, who was dedicated to the annual springtime resurrection of her murdered and dismembered husband Osiris, thereby creating the bloodline that was capitalized upon by Dan Brown in 2003 for his novel and subsequent blockbuster motion picture adaptation, The Da Vinci Code. Of course, Lawrence's life, much of which served as the basis for his work, as observed by Elaine Feinstein, was every bit as varied and emotionally complex as are the different forms of his writing. With respect to particulars, D.H. Lawrence was born in 1885, the 4th out of 5 children for a miner and his former school teacher, middle-class aspiring wife, who'd come to feel that she had married beneath her, and apparently never let either her husband or their offspring forget it. At the age of 13, David Herbert Lawrence won a scholarship to the Nottingham High School, being regarded as an outsider by many of his classmates. He also began visiting the family of friends of his mother's on a nearby farm, where he became the close companion, as a result of a shared love of literature, to Jessie Chambers, who Lawrence would later call Miriam within his largely autobiographical novel Sons and Lovers, and who it was that eventually sent out the first samples of his writing for publication, thereby serving to bring him into the acquaintance of such literary figures as Bloomsbury Group members Leonard and Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forrester, Bertram Russell, and Lady Adeline Morel. However, following Lawrence's fictionalized characterization of Miss Chambers within Sons and Lovers, she never spoke to him again. Also, although Lawrence and Jessie Chambers had developed what the editors of the Penguin Classics have termed an unofficial engagement, that understanding had been somewhat abruptly ended when the young writer embarked upon a brief sexual affair with a local chemist's wife before then becoming engaged to a classmate from Nottingham College, the very lovely Louisa Barrows. Around this time, according to the chronology included within the Penguin edition of the Rainbow, Lawrence lost his faith in a personal human god, his older brother died, and their mother nursed the fledgling writer through a serious illness that forced him to give up teaching as a career before dying herself of cancer in 1910, about 1 month before her son's first novel, The White Peacock, was published. Year following his mother's death, D.H. Lawrence met the wife of his former modern language tutor, a mother of 3 children who was 6 years older than he, Frida, Baron von Richtover's cousin, who herself had previously had an affair with a Freudian psychiatrist who strongly advocated the free and unrestrained expression of the libido, and within just over a month, she and Lawrence ran off to Germany together, leaving her husband and children behind them in England. This was what began the many travels and notorious domestic quarrels that would come to dominate much of the rest of D.H. Lawrence's life. After having crossed the Alps on foot from Germany to Italy, the fugitive couple returned to England, became friends with Catherine Mansfield and her husband, John Middleton Murray, Frida finally obtaining a divorce without access to her children, before Lawrence and she quickly married in July of 1914. However, thanks to the beginning of the First World War about 1 month later, they became unable to return to the continent, subsequently living in extreme poverty, as well as by the generosity of Lawrence's literary acquaintances, settling on the coast of Cornwall, where, because of Frida's German heritage and extended family connections, they became suspected of signaling to enemy submarines and were forced to move at least twice before finally becoming able to return to Italy following the armistice that ended the war to make the world safe for democracy at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. From there, in 1922, the year of the publication of both T.S. Eliot's response to the carnage of the war to end all wars, The Wasteland, and James Joyce's nostalgic cubist stream of consciousness look back to a time a decade before the beginning of hostilities, Ulysses, the Lawrences traveled to Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, south of the subcontinent of India, and then Australia, before moving on at the invitation of a wealthy writer, salon hostess, and patron of the arts named Mabel Dodge, who had also encouraged artist Georgia O'Keeffe to come to the southwestern United States, and whose fourth husband was a Pueblo Indian named Antonio Lujan, to whom Dodge had been introduced by his quickly divorced former wife. 2 years later, another property, which then became named Kiowa Ranch, was acquired from their patron in exchange for the manuscript of Sons and Lovers. Trips to Mexico followed, as well as a return to Italy, a brief visit to England, and then Switzerland, before, due to his poor health, Lawrence and Frida headed back to the Mediterranean coast for the warmer weather, where at the age of 44 he died and was buried in Vence, France in 1930. Still, the story doesn't really end there, because 5 years after that, Frida's third husband, Angelo Ravighelli, the landlord of a property at which she and Lawrence had lived before going to stay with brave New World author Aldous Huxley and his first wife Maria on the Riviera, an Italian military officer in the service of Benito Mussolini's make the trains run on time authoritarian government, with whom Frida had an affair during Lawrence's final illness, arranged to have the author's body exhumed and cremated, planning to bring the ashes back to the Kiowa ranch. But, according to some sources, rather than paying a fee to transport human remains, Rabigelli poured them into the Mediterranean Sea and instead brought back soil from the original grave site to be installed within a shrine adjacent to the ranch, where Frida was also buried when she passed away 21 years later in 1956. Now, with all this rich source material during his life, D.H. Lawrence had quite a lot to work with. For example, he took the premise of a romantic triangle, as narrated by a young woman's brother, and turned that into a tale leading to 2 unhappy marriages in the White Peacock. And then he revisited his early life up to the death of his mother as the basis for Sons and Lovers. And, by the way, could there be a more Oedipal title before taking on the landscape of his childhood to capture its evolution over 3 generations from the 1840s to 1910 in The Rainbow, ending that book with an epiphany regarding the future as expressed by one of the granddaughters of the initial protagonist who drowned in a flood decades before, a young woman named Ursula Brangwyn, after she'd experienced a lesbian interlude, which is what caused the book to be suppressed, and then a miscarriage following an unplanned pregnancy with a former fiancé who she had rejected, and who then went off to India and married someone else without ever knowing about his potential child. Lawrence stating that Ursula saw in The Rainbow the Earth's new architecture, the old brittle corruptions of houses and factories swept away, the old world built up in a living fabric of truth, fitting to the overarching heaven. Ursula, apparently based upon Frida Lawrence, and her sister Gundren, whose personality was seemingly derived from Catherine Mansfield, then became 2 of the central characters in Women in Love, a work that has generally been acknowledged as Lawrence's greatest novel. Ursula, a teacher, and Gundren, an art student, begin this book by expressing their reluctance to marry, but then go to watch a marriage at a church nearby their parents' home, see and later meet 2 men at a party, Rupert Birkin, apparently reflecting characteristics of Lawrence, and Gerald Critch, seemingly based, at least in part, upon Catherine Mansfield's husband, John Middleton Murray, but who is also described as bearing the mark of Cain due to having accidentally caused the death of his brother as a child. Gerald is also somewhat clearly demonstrates his aggressive nature when he brutally controls a horse while riding after it becomes frightened by the roaring technology of a steam locomotive. Although she denied ever having had a sexual relationship with D.H. Lawrence, as suggested in Women in Love, according to Elaine Feinstein, Lady Adeline Morel did take lovers, largely due to her husband's lack of attraction to her. These included philosopher Bertram Russell, and, although not a gamekeeper like Lady Chatterley or a Scottish servant like Queen Victoria following Prince Albert's death, an unnamed stonemason. In Lawrence's book, a relationship with Rupert Birkin and Lady Morell's literary avatar ended when the character of Hermione, in anger, struck Birkin in the head with a heavy paperweight. Later, in chapter 22 of the book, following Ursula's initial rejection of Rupert, as graphically demonstrated by Alan Bates and Oliver Reed in the 1969 British motion picture adaptation of the novel, Birkin and Gerald Critch, who seemingly represents modernity and industrialization through the use of machines, wrestle naked with one another, after which, as described by Lawrence, they remained exhausted and breathless. Then, later, when Gerald's sister had accidentally drowned, Gudrun becoming a tutor to his younger sister before his father also died, making him the sole very wealthy owner of a productive mining company, Gerald and Gudrun consummate their relationship while Birkin and Ursula reconcile and marry, the four of them going off together on a trip to the Alps, with Gudrun becoming attracted to an artist acquaintance from Dresden, and Gerald nearly strangling her to death during a jealous rage before stalking off into a snow-packed valley where he falls asleep and freezes to death, causing Birkin to observe, in spite of loving Ursula, that he would always value the relationship he had had with Gerald. Although it can be tempting to try to interpret these four characters as being somewhat allegorical figures for education and art and modernity, their complexity as human beings seem, to me at any rate, to make them distinct individuals rather than merely representatives of abstract concepts, even while seeming to suggest attributes which add an overall broader significance to their actions. Within Women in Love, however, Lawrence does seem to explore almost all the major themes of his other writing, and paintings for that matter. Sexual desire, the ongoing struggle among the social classes and between the genders, the will to power, as expressed by Friedrich Nietzsche, and the nature of love, showing, as he observed in a novella titled The Ladybird, no form of love is wrong, as well as his belief that people must willingly choose authoritarian rulers and put their lives into the hands of the greater men among them. Also, in spite of his own poor health, Lawrence seemed to be an advocate for eugenics, the science of selective control of the human population, as demonstrated at the end of what's probably his most famous short story, The Rocking Horse Winner, when the brother of a woman whose special needs autism spectrum child had died after winning her 80,000 pounds on long-shot horse racing bets, rather coolly states, he's best gone out of a life where he rides his rocking horse to find a winner. Having died himself 2 years before Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor in Germany, unlike prolific poet and editor Ezra Pound, who who was arrested and confined in a mental institution for a number of years because of his active support for fascism, D.H. Lawrence did not get to witness the unrestrained implications of some of his authoritarian leanings, many of which seem to be attractive to a large number of American voters to this very day. Nonetheless, even 30 years after his death, Lawrence's last novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which had been completed in 1928, was still a source of controversy, as well as the cause of a 1960 trial in England, which ultimately recognized the book's literary merit and determined, like the New York Supreme Court case in 1933 about James Joyce's Ulysses, that the novel was neither pornographic nor obscene. Instead, it seems what D.H. Lawrence provides to readers in each of his works is a frank and sensually honest depiction of human nature, impulses, and desires that is well worth attention. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.